just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem, and we're going to go down into the valley of Gehenna, the valley of hell. It's a long walk. We're just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem. In fact, what we're walking down this morning is we're coming down into the valley of Ben Hinnom. It's one of the two deep ravines that sort of frames up Jerusalem. One is the Kidron Valley going across the eastern side of the city, and this one's on the southern side of the city. And these two valleys come down, and a lot of water collects here. The Gehenna Spring is down at the bottom. It would have been very easy to have established water-holding ponds here. And that's one of the reasons I came here. Because Ahaz once came somewhere in a location like this to check on his water supply. Ahaz was a king of Judah. Remember, in the north was Israel and the south was Judah. Ahaz is the king of Judah. And things are starting to turn against both Judah and Israel politically. The Assyrians are rising as a world power. And Ahaz is like every single one of us. He's starting to make some decisions about his future and his faith. And the question is confronting him pretty much point blank of whether or not his faith is going to have anything to do with his future. And so as the Assyrians were really starting to make a lot of noise and Ahaz was feeling the pressure, he comes out to check on his water supply. And the prophet Isaiah is the prophet that God sends to Ahaz out there by that pool where he's checking on his military security, his ability to stay alive. And Isaiah confronts him with a message from God. God offers Ahaz a chance for a miraculous deliverance from this military threat. And in one translation of the Bible it says that Isaiah's message goes to Ahaz like this: if you do not stand firm in your faith, Ahaz, you will not stand at all. Ahaz chose to not stand at all. He made some terrible political decisions and some horrible military decisions. In fact, by the time his reign ended, Judah was in such terrible shape that his son Hezekiah found himself in the worst noose that Judah had ever found itself. Ahaz had a son, his name was Hezekiah. Hezekiah would have a son named Manasseh. But Hezekiah found himself in just a terrible bind. The Assyrians took the northern kingdom. The Assyrians came down and started sweeping through all of the south. And every little community they came to, whether it had walls or not, was just overwhelmed by the Assyrian force. They were an incredible world power. Judah was down very much so politically, economically. Assyria was just having its way. In fact, it took everything except Jerusalem. And so the Assyrian army came here and surrounded Jerusalem and set a siege to it. They didn't really want to tackle these huge walls that surrounded Jerusalem. They didn't want to give up their soldiers, and so they just set around a siege and decided to outweight all of those who were inside. Hezekiah is the king of God's people. Hezekiah has that same question that his father had, that his son would have, and that you and I have, and that is whether or not his faith would affect his future. And Hezekiah received a letter from the commander of the Assyrians and said, Hezekiah, surrender now. Here are the terms of your surrender. If you will surrender, I'll let you live and I'll let your people live. Otherwise, you will be destroyed completely. And the language was very harsh. You know what Hezekiah did? The Bible tells us he received the letter from the messengers and read it. And then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. I love that imagery of the king laying down before God with this letter saying, oh God, please help us. You're our only hope. And the Bible tells us that the very next morning, as the city must have been up all night, their existence was right on the line, but the next morning they walk out and tens of thousands of Assyrian soldiers are laying dead all around Jerusalem. But I'll tell you something else Hezekiah did. While he was waiting on the miracle of God, he went to work. The water supply that his father had checked on, Hezekiah knew that without water they couldn't survive a siege. And so while they were waiting on God to work that miracle, they did some work that is in evidence for us to experience today. that makes for one of the most remarkable stories in all the Bible. Since Hezekiah knew the Assyrians were coming, he knew he had better get Jerusalem ready for a siege. To do that, he had his workers dig a tunnel through the bedrock of the city, a tunnel that would be 1/3 of a mile long when finished. After the tunnel was completed, he diverted the path of the Gehenna spring through the tunnel, ensuring his people of all the water they would need, and at the same time, keeping the water away from the enemy. Workers started at opposite ends and clawed their way toward the other team, finally meeting in the middle after months of hard labor. Hezekiah's tunnel is a reminder that this king was a man of great faith. He did not hesitate to ask God for a miraculous delivery, but while he was waiting on the miracle, he didn't hesitate to work very, very hard. As I leave the valley of Gehenna, leave the valley of hell, I'm still kind of overwhelmed with the question of whether or not our faith will affect our future. And you think about the stories of Ahaz, who failed that test of faith. You think about his son Hezekiah, who passed it wonderfully. What a miracle in the midst of all the hard work. What a great legacy Hezekiah left. But boy, the saddest part of that story is, as Hezekiah gave that legacy of faith to his son wasted the legacy. His name was Manasseh, and for 55 years, he literally was the worst king that Judah ever had. He sacrificed his children in the fire, offering them to some false god named Moloch, in the valley of Gehenna, right where we are. Manasseh should have learned from his father, should have seen how God miraculously took care of his father, but he wasted it. I want to tell you something. The lesson of this valley, the lesson of the Bible may boil down to something like this. If you've been given a godly heritage, thank God for it. You didn't do a thing to earn it. God just gave it to you. The way Hezekiah gave it to Manasseh. But you know, it is our responsibility. Every generation has a responsibility to protect that heritage, to develop a new legacy to pass on to the next generation. We've got to do that. We've got to get it done.